I'm Katrina from KatrinaKCreations.com, where I teach curvy women how to sew for their curves. Today, we're going to sew a narrow hem. If you haven't seen my previous videos about adding a flounce to a skirt, I've put the links to those videos in the description. I'm going to put a narrow hem in this flounce before I attach it to the skirt, because I already know from my muslin that the length of my skirt is where I want it to be. So the first thing we're going to do is machine baste around the flounce 3/16 of an inch from the edge. I've given this a 3/8 of an inch hem allowance, so half of 3/8 is 3/16. So that's where that measurement 3/16 is coming from. It's half of 3/8, which is the total amount of my hem allowance. Now, if you don't like that weird fraction, you can also use a 1/2 inch hem allowance and sew half that amount or 1/4 of an inch from your edge. Remember, this is a narrow hem, so I wouldn't do anything wider than 1/4 of an inch. I personally just wanted mine to be just a little bit less. It is only a 1/16 of an inch difference, but I wanted it to be a little less than 1/4 of an inch hem. I just like the way that looks. But again, I always talk about what is your personal preference. Whatever your personal preference is, then do that. So now let's go to the sewing machine. Because my sewing machine doesn't have a marking, of course, for 3/16 of an inch, I just put a piece of tape here as a guide as I'm sewing. And I've already set my sewing machine to the basting stitch that I want to use to sew this stitch guide around the edge of my flounce. So I'm just lining the edge of my fabric up with the edge of the tape. And because this is a basting stitch, I'm not going to back stitch. And because I'm not doing any back stitching, I just sewed a little past where I started. Now we can take this to the ironing board. So now I'm doing the first press on this narrow hem, and I'm simply using my stitching that I just sewed as a guide, so I'll know exactly where to turn this fabric up and press. And if you don't have a tool to protect your fingers, which I don't, then just make sure you're careful doing this. And finger pressing, it helps. And now that I'm done with my pressing, I'm going to go back to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew very close to this folded edge. I'm just using this pen to hold things down while I get everything situated on the machine. Again, we're going to use a basting stitch and we're going to sew close to our folded edge. And as a guide, I'm just going to line up my fold right next to this part here on my throat plate, and that should put my needle where I want it to be. And to test this, I'm just going to put my needle down into the fabric, and that's about as close as I want it to my edge. And I won't be back stitching this either because this is not our final stitch. And I can remove that pin. And now we're ready to go back to the ironing board. So we've sewn this down close to the fold. And if you look at your seam allowances, if you see anything that you feel needs to be trimmed, this would be a good time to do that. And we're going to turn this up one more time and press it in place all the way around the flounce. And the next stitch we sew will be our final stitch. And again, watch your fingers. Now that everything is all pressed, we're going to go back to the machine and stitch it down, do our final stitching. Now, I don't want to sew on top of my basting stitch here. I want to sew maybe next to it because I'm probably going to remove this basting stitch. But what I'm going to do is move my tape because this is about where I want to sew, and I've changed my upper thread so you can see which one is the final stitch. And so I'm going to line this up right next to that tape and sew all the way around. And of course, this time I want to back stitch because this is my final stitch. And we're using the 2.5 stitch length. This is not a basting stitch. So we're using our regular stitch length and we are back stitching. And I want to control this a little bit, so I'm going to put my hand here and hopefully I can get in between here and not right on my basting stitch. I'm going to take my time and sew all the way around. I also want you to see that by using this tape as a guide, it also helps me to keep it pretty straight on the right side of the fabric. So the narrow hem is all done, and I'm all done at the machine. So let's go back to the table. And this is what the finished narrow hem looks like on the right side of my flounce. And on the inside of my flounce, you can see my good stitching, which is the red stitching, plus the 2 basting stitches that I did. I like to remove the basting stitches, although it doesn't look this bad when you are using thread that matches your fabric. But I still prefer to remove the basting stitches. So I took a small section of the basting stitches out just to show you what the final narrow hem would look like on the inside. So now the hem of the flounce is finished, and it can be attached to my skirt. And that's how you sew a narrow hem. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. You can also find me over at KatrinaKCreations.com, and thank you for watching.